Section Introduction. Welcome to this section where we'll talk about the most used tools in Photoshop for web design projects. Our goal is to get familiar with how these tools work and explore real scenarios through which you can get your hands dirty. By working on all these mini projects, you'll better understand the tools, plus you'll get more experience. You'll see I won't cover absolutely everything in the left panel, and that's because Photoshop is a very complex program that can be used for lots of tasks, so some of these tools are irrelevant for our web design needs. However, if you want a more in-depth look, I advise you to check out my other course called Photoshop for Beginners, which talks about all these tools in more detail, not specifically related to web design. Plus, everything we'll discuss will be covered again in the freelancing projects that come up later in the course, so don't feel intimidated if you don't get something on the first go. The vast majority of these tools are the same in both CS6 and CC 2017. There've been a few improvements here and there, but nothing to shout about, so don't be surprised if you don't see as many lectures separated based on the program's version. Okay, remember to download the PSD files attached to each lecture and practice by yourself. In this section, you won't have specific lectures that are exercises because every video is actually an exercise. So after you've finished watching, download the attachments and get to work. Okay, let's get to it. Hi, in this video we'll talk about some key aspects about artboards in Photoshop CC 2017. This is a somewhat new addition to Photoshop, and in this lecture I'll try to answer as many questions as possible. What are artboards and what do they do? You can think of artboards like another type of group in the Layers panel. They're useful when you want to design several versions of the same concept within one document and you want to see them side by side. An example would be this. You have your design, but you're unsure about the color scheme. No problem. Create several versions with artboards, put them side by side, and easily decide which looks best. Artboards are also great when you want to create multiple screens from the same project. For our web design work, this means that instead of having 5 PSD files like Home, About Us, Portfolio, Services, Contact Us, you'll have just one PSD that contains 5 artboards. And I gave a conservative example. Think about a project with 50 pages. This makes it easy to change your font family or a particular design element because you don't have to reopen all those projects separately. The last advantage of using artboards is being able to create several versions of the same design, desktop, tablet, and mobile. That's really helpful if you're creating a responsive website. How do you create an artboard and how do you get rid of them? You can create an artboard anytime. When you start a new project, if you select Web or Mobile App Design, you'll have various presets. All of these come with artboards by default. So when I hit OK, you'll see my canvas now looks like this. How can you tell you have an artboard in your project? Well, you can see its name in the top left on the canvas, but you can also see it in your Layers panel. Let me create a folder so you can compare how they look. They're different from one another, so there's no confusing them. In case you're in a regular project with no artboards, you can use the special tool for it from the left panel. Select it and drag anywhere on the canvas. Now you have an artboard. You can right-click on any layer or group in the Layers panel and create an artboard from it. It's as easy as that, so don't worry about setting them right from the get-go. To get rid of an artboard, you need to right-click it in the Layers panel and hit Ungroup Artboard. Now you're back in the regular version. If you have several artboards, you can also click on their name in the Layers panel and press the Delete key. But this one works only if you have more than one. How do you make more of them? Once you're in the artboard mode and you have one selected, you can click on any of these plus symbols on the canvas and you'll get a new one with those specific dimensions. Note it doesn't copy its contents, just the size. If you want to create a perfect replica, hold down Alt while you click on the plus symbol. Your canvas is infinite, so you can expand in any direction. You can use this tool to create additional ones as well. Just click it, select your desired size from the drop-down, and click anywhere on your canvas. There you go. How do you adjust them? First, you have to select an artboard to edit it. You can click on its name from the canvas while on the Move tool. You can tell it's active because these handles and the 4 plus symbols appear. And those handles are the key here. Use them to resize it as much as you want. If you want precision, you can use either this area here and input certain values, or the Properties panel here, which does the same thing. You can also use either of these two drop-downs to resize it to a specific size, for example iPhone 6 Plus. If you overlap it with another one, just drag it to a new position. Your Artboard tool shares the same hotkey with the Move tool, and it quickly reverts back to it when you click in a certain way. It's like Photoshop knows you want to use the Move tool, not the Artboard tool. Now, let's jump into various tips and bits of information about them. If you want to see if you're using artboards, you can do this. While on the Move tool, right-click on an empty space on the canvas and change your color to something else, say light grey. Now, if we create a new document with no artboards, you'll see its background is the default one, nearly black. This is how you can easily see what's what. If you're working on a mobile app, you probably want to switch your artboard orientation from portrait to landscape and vice versa. Do that by clicking on these two buttons. It immediately changes their layout. To quickly align artboards, select a few and use these alignment tools. This will come in handy if you have lots of screens. Speaking of alignment tools, you may remember I previously mentioned if you have a layer inside an artboard, you immediately get access to this region. Click on Left Align Edges and your element will move on the left-hand side of the artboard. Good stuff. Considering you'll use this new tool to cut down your number of PSD files, you can expect to have a humongous layers panel. To help you focus on what you're working on, you can filter out all the other layers except the ones from your active artboard. Change this from Kind to Artboard, and now as I select various ones from the screen, my layers panel changes. It's only showing me those layers. Great stuff. When you're designing inside an artboard, you'll see its edges will act like a clipping mask. So if I draw a rectangle that's too wide for it, that won't be a problem as the excess is hidden. That is super useful. One thing to note is if you create a layer outside an artboard, that's where Photoshop will place it in the layers panel, above all the rest. See here, it's not inside any of them. But if you move it above an artboard, it will move it inside as the first layer. As you can see, it changes positions in the layers panel as I move it on the canvas. If you want to prevent that, select any artboard in the layers panel and hit this button. Now I'll create another rectangle outside any artboard. Now I'll move it above it. Nothing happens, and that's exactly what we wanted. You can still add layers to your artboard by moving them in the layers panel, so it's not like you're locked out, but this feature might come in handy. Regarding guides, make sure you have your rulers active. If not, use Ctrl-R. Since your screens might be different, when you drag out a guide, that will be specific to that artboard. Let me drag a few. And now as I move my artboard, the guides follow suit. When you move to another one, those you previously set are temporarily hidden. If you want to see them, open your preferences with Ctrl-K. Go to Guides, Grid and Slices. From here, check Show Inactive Artboard Guides. I recommend you switch the colour to green so you can better see them. Great, now you can see both the active ones from your current artboard and the inactive ones. I'd advise against it though, so take my word and deactivate this feature. If you want to use the old global guides, you can still do that, just have no artboard selected or any layer inside an artboard. You can click on an empty area in the Layers panel. Now, if you drag, you'll recognize this is a global guide that's independent. In case you're having trouble deselecting everything, you can always leave one stray rectangle outside your artboards. Use Ctrl-Click to select it, and now you can drag out your guides. And that's it. Now, let me give you 3 last points and we're done. 1. Do I use artboards in my web design projects? The answer is no. I only use them when I'm designing an Android app and only if it will have over 5 screens. 2. Why not use them? Well, some developers are still stuck with Photoshop CS6, which doesn't have artboards, so when you send the PSD over, they'll have issues with it. Here's one project in Photoshop CC, and now here it is opened in CS6. So it's not ideal. 3. Any major drawbacks? Yes, it seems your PSD size will increase dramatically sometimes. You'll soon understand what's what, but as an idea, this first PSD has nearly 2 gigabytes, while if I saved everything separately like I was working in CS6, all these files combined have 600 megabytes, so artboards might increase your project size. I'm sure I'm going to transition fully to them in the next period. Photoshop is pushing for them quite a lot, and the few remaining bugs are bound to be solved soon. Okay, recreate all my steps from this video. You have all the files attached. Have fun! Gain flexibility with Undo and the History panel. Hello, one major feature you'll undoubtedly use in Photoshop is the ability to undo your steps. By understanding how Undo and the History panel work, you'll no longer fear you're creating irreversible changes. Let's jump into a project and explore them. You already saw me undo one step throughout this entire course. That's useful when you want to identify a layer on the canvas. I select it from the Layers panel, and while on the Move tool, I try to identify it by changing its position. This works most of the time, and it's one of my preferred methods of discovering layers. This is all possible with Ctrl-Z. It doesn't make sense for you to put it back in its original position manually. Instead, you undo that step with the hotkey I just mentioned, or you could go to Edit, Undo State Change. I'm sure you're aware of how undo works in most programs, but the difference in Photoshop is this. Press Ctrl-Z once and you'll undo your action. Press it again and it will redo. So the program will not take you yet another step back, instead it moves you forward. This is helpful when you want to toggle back and forth between two options. For example, I'll add a brightness and a contrast adjustment layer, and I'll turn the first slider down to about -35. Now I'll press Ctrl-Z to undo it. Ctrl-Z yet again to redo that step. And now I can enter full screen mode by using the F key twice and see if my action improves the project. That's why I really appreciate the way this tool works. You may ask yourself, how can you go back several steps? Well, let me do a few more things to this project and you'll see your options. I'll resize the image to about half its size. It's far too big and I'm not happy with it. I'll also increase the saturation for the flower. Okay, and I'll add a few rectangles to this A5 paper. Let's open up the History panel. So several steps are being added. Photoshop records everything. It should be docked here, or you can go to Window, History. Increase the size by clicking and dragging from this area. If you focus on this new panel, you'll see it describes everything I did in the project. So now, if we want to go back several steps, we can first use Ctrl-Z, and that takes us back one step. You can see that reflected in this panel immediately. Now I'll use Ctrl-Alt-Z to go back yet again. And now my action is greyed out. Ctrl-Alt-Z can be used as much as you want. As you can see, I'm constantly using it, and step by step I'm going backwards. You don't have to have this panel opened to use the hotkey. I'm keeping it here so you can better see what's going on. And you can use it immediately. You don't have to use Ctrl-Z, then Ctrl-Alt-Z. It's your choice. If you want to go back to a specific step, for example the image resize, you can click on it and Photoshop will take you to that state. So if that was a mistake, just click above it and now your project will be reverted. However, if you now perform another action, say draw a rectangle somewhere, you'll see your greyed out history is gone. Photoshop allows you to go back in time, but you can't adjust one step and then expect all your other actions to be applied over it. So that's something to remember. Let's sum it up. Ctrl-Z takes you back one step, press it again and it takes you forward. Ctrl-Alt-Z is used to undo an infinite number of actions. You can also use the History panel if you don't want to use that hotkey too many times. I recommend you have 20 to 30 steps in your History panel. For our web design work, that should be enough and it's not very taxing on your computer. If you require more, then there might be a problem with the way you work. If you're more comfortable with 50 or 75 steps, open the preferences with Ctrl-K and go to Performance. From here, you can edit the number of steps Photoshop will remember. The maximum is 1,000, but I highly doubt you'll need that many. One last thing before we go is the ability to revert to the original project state. Say you really messed up and you want to start over. Using Ctrl-Alt-Z isn't the best choice. Instead, you can click on this area here and everything will be discarded. By the way, if you save your PSD file, all these grayed out actions will not appear the next time you open it. Photoshop discards them, so that's something to notice. I don't like to move my cursor away from the canvas, so to revert back to my original state, I like to use F12. This does the exact same thing, but I think it's faster. And that's the undo feature and the history panel. You have this file attached, jump to it and recreate my steps. If you have questions, just let me know through the comments sections. Have fun! Unlock the power of the marquee tool. Welcome to this lecture where we'll talk about the marquee tool. Its name might not tell you much, but it's one of the tools I use constantly in my projects. Okay, let's get started. First, its hotkey is M, but you can also select it from the Tools panel on the left. It breaks down into two main tools, rectangular marquee and the elliptical marquee. The other two are rarely used, so we'll ignore them. Their name implies the differences between them, but let me quickly illustrate. Here's the rectangular marquee, and here's the elliptical one. What I just did is called a selection. That's what the marquee tool does at its core. It creates selections. Otherwise put, you isolate a certain number of pixels from the particular layer you've selected. That means you can get the brush tool and paint over the canvas like crazy, but only your selection will suffer the edits. That gives you fantastic flexibility. We have several selection tools available and we'll discuss some in this section. Right now, our focus is on the marquee tool. After you've made a selection on the canvas, you'll see what's called marching ants in the industry. That tells you a selection is active in that area. If you want to deselect, you can hit Ctrl-D, or you can go to Select, Deselect. By default, after you've made one selection, if you repeat the process, you'll discard your initial one. So let's say I selected this sky region, but I wanted to get some of the sea as well. If I drag again, I won't get a combined selection, instead I'll get the latest one. If you want to add to that selection, you need to hold down the Shift key. You'll immediately notice a plus symbol next to your cursor. That means you'll expand your region. If you hold down Alt, you'll remove parts from it. As you can see, the selection shrinks. I advise you to get it right from the start. I rarely use these modifier keys to adjust my initial selection. An important thing to note is the current layer you're working on. If you create a selection on a raster layer, everything is good. You get complete freedom. You can see this layer falls into that category. So I can use the marquee tool to remove the sun. I'll make a selection next to it, then I'll use Ctrl-T. Now I'll drag towards the right. And there you go, no more sun. Essentially, I'm stretching over those pixels from my selection, but since it's a solid color, we will have no artifacts or any issues. Remember not to use this technique if you have patterns, textures, or anything other than a solid color. Now I'll get the ellipse tool and draw my sun. I'm using Shift to constrain its proportions, making it a perfect circle. Now I'll double-click its thumbnail and change its color to a nice yellow, something similar to our sand. Okay, looking good. Note the difference. I have this shape layer selected, and I'll try to recreate my previous steps. I'll get the marquee tool, I'll make the selection, and I'll try to use Ctrl-T, but nothing happens. There's nothing wrong with my keyboard, that's how selection tools work. They need raster layers. Here we have a shape layer. If we try the same thing on the Smart Object on the Layers panel, you'll see the same story. We can't transform it, even though I'm pressing Ctrl-T. Not only that, but we can't paint over it. We can't directly adjust it. Also, if you have two or more raster layers stacked on top of each other, the marquee tool only works on the selected one, so it doesn't drill down and isolate all those pixels. Plus, if you select several raster layers, here I will just duplicate this one and use Ctrl-T, you'll see it's like I don't have a selection active. So that's not how you should use this tool. Instead, focus on one layer at a time. Another interesting thing you can do with marquee is remove parts of raster layers. For example, say I want to reuse the central region from this project in another one. I'll get the marquee tool, make my selection, and get the Move tool. As you can see, it's like I'm cutting it out. Let me undo. If you create a new project and repeat the process, you'll notice something interesting. You seem to cut it from the canvas and place it in another project, but when you return, you'll see it's still there. That's because Photoshop makes a copy for you. Speaking of that, you can duplicate that region you selected with Ctrl-J. Another interesting technique that involves the marquee tool is this. You can delete regions with precision. Let me demonstrate. I'll first create a copy of this smart object and I'll rasterize it. Remember, you can do that by right-clicking in the Layers panel and hitting Rasterize Layer, or you can get a brush or the eraser and click once. Quickly press OK and it does the same thing. Now I want this sand shape to be perfectly straight on its right side. The marquee tool is great for this type of precision work. I'll make my selection and I'll press Delete. Now I'll introduce you to the Fill command. Use Shift F5 and this dialog will appear asking you how you want to fill that region. I want to use a color. Immediately you get the color picker and I'll sample anywhere on the sand. Use Ctrl-D to deselect and Ctrl-1 to zoom back out at 100%. I'm not sure how impressive this seems, but I can assure you it's a technique I use constantly. Other selection tools don't achieve this pixel-perfect precision with ease. Here, the rectangle marquee gives you straight lines 100% of the time. The last interesting way of using this tool is for aligning objects precisely. Let's say we want to move our sun between these two birds. I want it exactly in the middle. How can we do that fast? My answer is this. Make a selection with the marquee tool. Try to be as accurate as possible, starting from the left all the way to the right. Zoom in if needed. Now, switch over to the Move tool. Your selection will remain active. Now use Align Horizontal Centers, and there you go. We had to use the marquee tool because all these objects are in one layer, so we couldn't select each bird individually or anything like that. The marquee tool is a real time saver, and I use this technique in many situations. Lastly, everything I mentioned applies to the elliptical marquee tool. One final boss mode technique I want to leave you with is this. Say we wanted to select the sun. Obviously, this calls for the elliptical marquee, but I'm not sure from where I want to start dragging. As you can see, I don't really have precision here. I'm selecting other bits too. Here's what you need to do. Zoom in and approximate where the center of the sun is. Drag from that point and hold down Alt and Shift. This creates the selection from your initial position of the cursor, aka the center of the sun. Now, as you expand your selection, you have an easier job getting it done right. But if you didn't approximate the center well enough, you may be a little to the side. How can you move this selection without letting go? Remember, if you let go, that's it. You'll either have to start over or try to add it with the Shift key, which will not go well. Here's the solution. While holding down the Shift and Alt key, add spacebar into the mix. I know it sounds crazy, but find some free parts of your hand and keep these 3 keys pressed. Now, with your mouse, you can reposition your selection until it's correct. I told you this is the final boss technique. Now that wraps up the marquee tools. I want you to download this PSD and recreate every step, including this last one. Have fun! Crop and eyedropper explained. Greetings! In this video, we'll discuss the crop tool and the eyedropper. These two don't always steal the spotlight, yet they do a fantastic supporting job. Let's start with the crop tool. Its hotkey is C, and its goal is to help you remove unwanted parts of an image. Take this example. I want to remove the reflection completely. By adjusting these handles, we get to do that easily. Press Enter, and there you go. But note a difference. If I try to expand my canvas in that region, you'll see it's empty, and that's because I have this Delete Cropped Pixels checked in the options bar. So let's undo our step and uncheck it. You might have to toggle between the crop tool and another one to get the handles to reappear. Now, if we perform the same steps, you'll see that upon expanding the canvas, we'll still get those pixels there. If you don't want to use these handles, you can just click and drag on any area you want cropped. It's an easy and straightforward tool, yet most of the time, I use it when I want to quickly expand my canvas. You just saw that, but here's the idea again. I'm working on a website design and this is my top section. Now I need more space underneath so I can put the rest of my content. The crop tool does that fast and easily. It's not that precise, though you can see the new measurements as you move your cursor down, but it's quick. An alternative for resizing your canvas is Ctrl-Alt-C. C stands for canvas, so that might help you remember it faster. From here, you can input new measurements. If you add 100 pixels in width, by default, Photoshop adds 50 to each side. If you want them added in a certain region, you have to use these arrows. So I'll add 1,000 pixels to the bottom of the canvas. That means I need to click on this top middle arrow. Through them, you're showing Photoshop where you want that extra space. So that's the crop tool briefly. One fancy feature just introduced in CC 2015.5 is this content aware option. Basically, in older versions of Photoshop, when you expanded the image, you'd get white or transparent pixels. If you check this option and repeat the process, you'll see Photoshop will try to create more of those pixels. We can continue our mountain in this right side. It's interesting, but to be honest, it's not that useful for web designing purposes. Still, it's nice to have it. The eyedropper helps you pick out any color from your screen. Here's how it works. Its hotkey is I, and it works with these two squares. This is the foreground, and this is your background color. So when you get the eyedropper and click anywhere, you'll see the foreground will change. See how it turned red because I sampled this boat thing? If you click and hold it, you'll see this appear. On the bottom, you have your current color, red, and at the top, you can see what you're sampling. This helps you decide if the new color is better than the old one. And as you move along, the eyedropper picks up on everything. And when I say everything, I mean everything. Let me jump to google.com and put it next to Photoshop. I'm sampling inside my canvas, but as I move away from the program, if I'm still holding my mouse click, I'm getting colors from my browser. See how it takes the colors from the Google logo? That's an amazing feature. If you want to revert to the default black and white colors, you can press the letter D. Focus on this area. There you go. You can also swap the two by using X. So if I'm painting with two particular colors, I don't have to change my foreground color every time I need to switch between the two. Instead, I paint a little with this one, I swap by using X, and then I can quickly use that. It's a great tool that you must use every time. But if you want to use a particular website to get a color code, you can double-click on any of these two and paste in your color code here. Press Enter, and you're good to go. Eraser Gradient Paint Bucket with a big twist. Welcome to this very interesting lecture where we'll talk about some tools you'll never use. The Eraser, Gradient and Paint Bucket tool. It's strange to say it, but let me put it another way. To achieve the same results these tools produce, you have far better options, at least for our web design needs. Let's start with the Eraser tool, which acts like a real-life one. It deletes things, and that's basically it. It works on rasterized layers only, and you have several options regarding how it performs. You can set its size, how fast it erases, and so on. All these are irrelevant for us. Here's a real-world example in a web design scenario. You see the right edge of this shape. It's unfortunately fuzzy and it needs to be removed. The layer is already rasterized, so I could theoretically use the eraser for that, and it'd go something like this. I'd zoom in, select a brush, customize its settings, then delete this area. Directly it wouldn't work, so I must make a selection or use another tool. Why go through all that trouble? Here's my approach. Take the rectangular marquee tool and make a selection. Now press Delete. You're done. Fast, precise. What else do you need? There are little or no cases where the eraser tool will come in handy in its regular function. What we'll use it for is to rasterize a layer quickly. If you have quick hands, it's very effective to hit E for the eraser. Click anywhere, and then press the spacebar when the warning comes up asking you about rasterizing the layer. There's another tool called Magic Eraser, and beginners sometimes expect this from Photoshop. You click on this sky, for example, and Photoshop immediately removes it. Trouble is, as you can see, it doesn't do a fantastic job. You have a slider here through which you fine-tune how loosely Photoshop matches pixels and subsequently deletes them, but this is not the right way to work. Here I'd use a selection tool and I'd use the delete key to remove it, or I'd use a mask to fine-tune my output. I won't demonstrate these techniques as that's not the point of this lecture, but what's important is that the eraser tool has little to no benefit usually. The gradient tool is yet another one. You select your gradient type, you adjust all its settings and you swipe to apply it. It only works on rasterized layers, and as you can see, it covers up just about everything. Even if you make a quick selection and use it, the problem is you're working destructively, meaning you're permanently editing those pixels and you have no options regarding adjusting those edits. I propose instead to use a gradient overlay. So in this case, I'll make a quick selection and duplicate the sky. Again, that's not essential, don't worry too much about it. Great. Now for the gradient, I'll click on this small FX button and I'll choose Gradient Overlay. From here, you'll see similar controls to the ones in the options bar at the top. The difference is this. If I don't like this gradient, I can disable it by clicking on this small eye icon. Or if I want to adjust it, I can open this panel again and modify all its settings. So for me in my workflow, there's no competition between these two. We'll talk more about layer styles later down the road, but this is what I suggest you do. Regarding the paint bucket tool, it's the same story. Its purpose is to fill a certain area with your foreground color. It has the same tolerance slider you can adjust to improve your outcome, but again, this is permanent. I'd rather use color overlay to achieve the same effect, but maintain editability. It's true that we must first create a selection and duplicate it, so there's extra steps, but you gain lots of freedom. In summary, I recommend you not use these tools. Instead, try my alternatives. I can guarantee a few Photoshop users will disagree with my approach, and they might find certain situations where you can use one of these tools just fine. Yet from my experience working so many years, I'm confident my alternatives will speed up your workflow. Okay, let's continue with some tools you will use. The brush tool and layer masks. Hey there. In this video, we'll talk about the brush tool and how we can use it to do some awesome stuff. The brush tool will not be helpful in the way you might expect. Its hotkey is B, and it acts like a real-life brush so you can paint with it. The color is set by your foreground color, which can be adjusted from here. Here's the general way of working. You first need a rasterized layer since it doesn't work on any other type. Then you set your initial color and you start painting. If you want to use colors that are already in your composition, you have to use the eyedropper tool, but the guys at Adobe made it super easy on us. Just hold down the Alt key and you'll immediately toggle to the eyedropper. Now you can sample any area and this changes your foreground color. To speed things even more, you can press X to swap these two. That means you can quickly paint with one color and then switch back to another one. And you can constantly sample other colors. You might think, what if I'm working on a project with 3 or 4 main colors instead of 2? Well, here are your options. First, the standard way is to use the Swatches panel. Open it from Window, Swatches. Now I'll sample a color and say I want to save it for later. It's easy. Simply go over to this area and you'll see your cursor will change. Click once and a new window will appear asking you for a name. Hit OK and that's it. Now you can see the swatch here, and if you click on this tiny icon you'll get many options, like resetting all these swatches, loading some new ones, etc. But if you want to remove one quickly, just hold down the Alt key and a scissor will appear on your cursor. This means you can delete it. That's the very standard approach, but unfortunately it takes up valuable space from this region. And since I don't approve of floating panels randomly on your canvas, here's an alternative. You create a few rectangles and you place them somewhere unobtrusive. You change their colors so they match your color scheme. And that's it. Now you can quickly do your thing and still have loads of space in the Layers panel. This is also great when you get a color scheme from the web. You can download or create swatches, but you can also print screen. Now you can paste it into your project and use the Marquee tool to select these 5 colors. Duplicate it with Ctrl-J and delete the rest. Now place it somewhere on your canvas, maybe shrink it down, and you're golden. As you work, you constantly sample from this area that takes up very little of your canvas space. One final thing about the brush tool for its general use is this. You have tons of presets that mimic real-life brushes in this panel. You can use Window Brush Presets if you don't have it. And as you can see, each produces a different result. If you have a tablet, these are even better. Plus, in the Brush tab, you can customize the heck out of it. Basically, you can get as hardcore as you want with it, I mean really in-depth. There are courses with hours dedicated to brushes alone, so as you can imagine, it's a vast subject. Enough general talk. Most likely you'll use none of these in your web design projects. We're not painters, and in web design we require pixel-perfect precision. Painting with brushes will rarely come in handy. Instead, we'll use them a lot with layer masks. Don't confuse layer masks with clipping masks. The latter is used with Ctrl-Alt-G to constrain a layer inside the shape of another layer. Let me undo that. Okay, let me explain what a layer mask does. A layer mask is used to hide a part of a layer non-destructively. Here I have a skyscraper, and I'd like to change this boring sky with another one. As you can see, I already have one prepared and it's underneath my building layer. Thing is, I don't want to permanently delete these pixels, that's not the right way to work in Photoshop. So I'll add a layer mask from the bottom of the Layers panel. Now you can see I have this white rectangle next to its thumbnail. Remember that a mask hides something. That's the easiest way to remember it. Here we want to hide this sky. Here's where our brush comes into play. I'll select it and I'll paint over the sky. See what happens? The layer that's underneath is revealed, or otherwise put, we're hiding part of this top layer. Now for a few other important details. Focus on the layer. See how this mask is selected? You can tell by checking out these 4 lines in the edges. That means the mask is active or selected. But if you click on its thumbnail, now the layer is selected. Now if you try to brush over it, you'll see you're using paints and we're messing things up. Notice my foreground and background colours. I have 2 specific ones I sampled earlier. But now if I select the layer mask, they immediately change to black and white. That's because on a layer mask, you can only paint with one of these 2. White reveals, black hides. So initially I'm painting with black to cover up my ugly sky, but if I'm careless and I paint over my building, I don't have to undo. Instead I'll use X to flip my colours and use white to paint over it. Now the building is slowly coming back. This is the real power of the brush tool. To control how big your brush is, you can use your square bracket keys on your keyboard. The left one shrinks your brush, while the right one enlarges it. You can do the same from the brush panel we talked about earlier. You'll use one of these 2 brushes, definitely a round one, but sometimes you may want a hard edge, while other times a softer one does the trick better. You can adjust that with the hardness slider. If it's 0% hard, you'll end up with a smooth, feathered transition. If you crank it up to 100%, you'll see there's no room for error. It produces a dramatic, abrupt result. Based on your images, you can choose one of the 2, or you can go somewhere in between. You can also turn down the opacity of your brush to get an even better result. This takes experience, but as you practice, you'll get better and better. Remember to apply the layer mask to the top layer, not the bottom one. If you want to disable it, you can right-click it and use Disable Layer Mask. You can also delete it or apply your changes permanently. But remember, layer masks are fantastic because they destroy no pixels. It's like an overlay through which you can do all sorts of edits, but if you're not happy, you can also go back and adjust it. And you don't have to rely on the Undo tool or the History panel for that. Layer masks can be used on any layer, even on adjustment layers. These are fantastic. Let me delete the previous one so we have a clean slate. Let's say I want to turn my sky into a weird colour. I'll add a hue and saturation adjustment layer. I'll check Colorize and I'll go to Town. Now everything is being affected, but I only want my sky to change. Guess what? Adjustment layers come with a layer mask by default. See this white rectangle? We can get a brush and paint over it. We want the building untouched. And as you can see, it does a great job. Well, I'm being sloppy, but you get the idea. This is the power of layer masks. But say you're sick of seeing sloppy work and you want a perfect result. No problem. Here's what you can do. Delete this layer because we don't need it. Now, let's make a quick selection. We'll talk about this tool in just a little bit. Okay, I have the entire sky selected. Add the adjustment layer, hit colorize, and there you go. I did that in a few seconds. If you take a few more moments to improve your selection, you can do an even better job. And as always, you can further work on it with the brush tool. One last thing before I go. Maybe you got confused and you wanted the building changed and the sky to remain as is. Not a problem. With the mask selected, hit Ctrl-I. This is the inverse command, and as you'd expect, it flips your mask. And with that, I invite you to perform the same steps I did. The images are attached to this lecture. Use any adjustment layer, try to combine the two photos by removing the sky non-destructively, and remember to have fun. Also, get creative. Browse around, get cool images you can combine, and post the result in the comments section. Let me see what you can do with this newfound knowledge. The powerful direct selection tool in CS6 and CC. Hello, let's talk about an unsung hero in Photoshop, the direct selection tool. Let's start in Photoshop CS6 and work our way up. In web design projects, we'll rely on shapes a lot. These are our foundation, and without editing them efficiently, you'd be in serious trouble. Here I have a rectangle and I'd like to adjust two of its corners. I want to move them towards the inside of the rectangle. How can we do that? If we try to use Ctrl-T, you don't have individual controls for each corner unless you resort to various trickery. You could right-click and select perspective, but that doesn't give me the precision I'm looking for. In comes the direct selection tool. Its hotkey is A, and it's the white one from the left panel. Please don't confuse it with the black cursor, as that does something different. So while we have the direct selection tool active, plus we're on a shape layer, we can drag and select an individual corner. See how this top left point is now black? That's called an anchor point, and its colour tells us it's selected. If we swipe again in the top right corner, we'll select that instead. If you want to get them both, you can add Shift into the mix. I'm now holding it down, and I'm dragging again. Great, now I have them both selected. This isn't that spectacular, as I could have swiped like this and gotten them both in one go. But if your points are in various places, Shift will get you out of a jam. You'll also notice the rectangle has a dark stroke of sorts. That tells us we have it selected, and it's called a path. If you don't see it, you have to use Ctrl-H. So this is the direct selection tool, and this allows us to modify any anchor point of any shape. I'll get the top left one again, and now with the Move tool active, I'll use my arrow keys to nudge it to the right. I could also move it with my mouse directly, and if I hold the Shift key, I'll move it in a straight line. Through this tool, you can adjust shapes as much as you want, but again, shapes, not raster layers, not smart objects, not text layers. You'll have to practice to get used to it. For example, if you click outside it, you'll see you'll deselect those anchor points, or if you use the black arrow by mistake, the Path Selection tool, you'll see it'll show you all points and you won't be able to select them individually unless you move to the Direct Selection tool. So let's recap. The Direct Selection tool is fantastic for modifying shape layers. You can select individual anchor points and move them freely. With it, you can achieve many new shapes, and this is not limited to rectangles. You can use it on custom shapes as well. As you can see, it works like a charm. We'll talk more about it when we talk about the Pen tool. The Direct Selection tool is a necessity in Photoshop CS6 due to a major inconvenience. Rounded rectangles are highly used in web design for many things, especially buttons. As you recall, you can adjust its corner radius from the options bar. Let's go with 10 pixels. Okay, the roundness is correct, but I want this shape much bigger. Let's resize it with Ctrl-T. Notice the difference. The corner radius of 10 pixels we previously set is out the door. This creates a whole load of trouble because it limits the use of the transform command. Without Ctrl-T, our speed will be seriously affected. Imagine having random corner radiuses throughout your project. That's going to make you look like a newbie in both the client's and developer's eyes. That's where the powerful Direct Selection tool comes into play. Here's how you enlarge a rounded rectangle in CS6 and maintain its set corner radius. You select the two right edges like so, And now you can use your mouse to enlarge it, like so. Remember, Shift constrains it to a straight line. Alternatively, you can use your arrow keys combined with Shift to expand it in 10-pixel increments. When you're done on one side, you move to the other one. Is this ideal? No, not really, but it's the best you can do in CS6, and this is why the Direct Selection tool is critical in your workflow. There is another option I use occasionally. You start with a regular-sized rounded rectangle and you enlarge it. Nothing new, the corners are still messed up. But if you click once on the canvas, you'll get this new window where you can input your precise measurements. The important thing is this. If you have another shape layer selected and you click on the canvas to create a new one, you'll automatically get its measurements here. So now if I click OK, I'll have the size I obtained with Ctrl+T, but a 10-pixel corner radius. And that's the Direct Selection tool in CS6. In Photoshop CC, it's a whole different story. Let's repeat the process there. Give it a second to load. OK, so a rounded rectangle with a 10-pixel radius. Now, we'll seriously enlarge it with Ctrl+T, but the corners remain unaffected. That's why it pays to upgrade. In the CC version, you no longer must use the Direct Selection tool to preserve your corner radius. You can still use it to manipulate your shapes, so it's still an important tool, but now you can transform without worry. Plus, a big upgrade over CS6 is this Live Shape Properties panel. From here, you can easily input a new corner radius. In CS6, what you put in is what you get. Here, you have complete flexibility. So that's the Direct Selection tool in both major releases of Photoshop. I advise you to enlarge a rectangle with the technique I previously showed you, even if you have the latest version. You'll see it'll come in handy in lots of situations. Have fun! Fantastic selections with the magic wand and the quick selection tool. Hello, let's talk about how we can get some awesome selections with two fantastic tools, the magic wand and the quick selection tool. I'm presenting these two because they do a great job with little effort. Of course, each image will pose a different challenge, so it's important you not get fixated on one particular tool or set of settings. Let's start with the magic wand and we'll try it out on this nice blue sky. I'll click anywhere and notice what happens. Photoshop looks for all pixels that are similar to the one I just clicked. If I click again, my selection is reset. That means to build up this area, you have to use Shift to expand your selection. Notice the plus symbol next to my cursor. And if Shift adds, then Alt removes. There you go. If you're unsure why Photoshop didn't select the entire thing, it's because our tolerance was set too low. By adjusting this field, you're letting Photoshop know how loose or strict it should look for matching pixels. A low value means we're looking for colours that are very similar to the one we clicked, so the lower you go, the more restrictive Photoshop will act. A higher tolerance number means we're broadening our range, so the program will look for colours more loosely. Here it's clear we have the various shades of blue, so we must crank up the tolerance quite a bit. Let's try 100. The maximum is 255, and that would include everything on the canvas. Depending on where you click, you might get a different result. If you now change this value, your selection will not adjust itself. You'll have to perform another click to see the difference. It seems I'm getting too much of this mountain, and that's because its colours are pretty washed out. Thing is, if I simply use Alt on it with my tolerance set so high, I'll shrink my selection a lot. See? So let's click again. And now, when I want to remove this area, I'll lower this value to about 25. Your results might not be perfect, but it's a good selection tool that aims to do the bulk of the job within 1 or 2 clicks. To finish it, you might need to use a myriad of other tools or features which I explain in other lectures from my courses. Remember, your result heavily depends on where you click. We're targeting an individual pixel due to this option because we're on point sample. If you want Photoshop to look for matching pixels based on area, you can use this drop-down. For example, 5x5 average might give you a better selection. Experiment and see which settings are ideal, but remember, it's all about the image you're working on. There's no magic formula even though it's called the Magic Wand tool. There's another interesting option called contiguous. Let me show it in action in another tab. If I uncheck it, look what happens. I'll click on any window, boom. The selection isn't limited to that area. Instead, Photoshop is looking for all those matching pixels on the entire canvas. If we use the contiguous option and we repeat the click, you'll see we'll only get that particular window. That's because it's surrounded by other pixels that don't match the one we clicked, so that's something to remember. Let's jump to the quick selection tool, which is probably my favourite. We'll go back to our initial image. This relies on the brush tool, but there's only one important factor in its settings: the size. Remember, you can easily control it with your square bracket keys. Here I'll go with 40 pixels. This tool works based on what you paint across, and it quickly expands your selection if Photoshop's algorithm determines those pixels go together. There's no tolerance, but you can fine-tune your results based on your brush size. The smaller the brush, the more precise it will become. If you click again, you will not reset your selection. Instead, you'll continue to add to it. If you want to remove parts of it, just hold down the Alt key. As you use Alt more and more on areas you don't want included, Photoshop takes that into consideration, and it does a better job. This is why it's one of my favourite selection tools, and I highly recommend it. Okay, now it's your turn. Get familiar with these tools and explore their settings. As always, you have the images attached. Have fun! Pen tool. The pen tool is one of those things that can really intimidate Photoshop users because it seems really complex when you first get started with it. I'm here to clear the air and show you how you can efficiently use it. There's two main reasons why a beginner should use the pen tool. First of all, custom shapes. These are vector layers that can be resized at any dimension. Photoshop already has some built in, but of course these can't possibly cover all your needs, so we can use the pen tool to create some of our own. First, hit the P key and get it. Make sure you're on it and not one of these other options. Now we'll focus up to see its settings. We want to select Shape from this drop-down. Regarding the fill, that's going to be taken from the foreground colour, but you can easily change it by clicking here. The next option is the stroke, and I always recommend you keep it off. That's what the diagonal red bar means, no stroke. So even though we have its weight set at 1 pixel and with a dotted appearance, it's not going to show up at all. Great, now we can click a few times and create something, an irregular shape that would be fairly difficult to create without the pen tool. Plus, this is a vector shape, so we can resize it easily. We can also double-click its thumbnail and adjust its colour. Pretty sweet. We don't have to have straight lines either. If you click, you set a point. If you then click and drag, you'll get a rounded line. As you can see right here, this allows for greater flexibility. If that's not enough, you can easily adjust your shape afterwards. Press A to access the direct selection tool, and now you can modify the roundness of the shape as you'd want. I'd much rather use the hotkey, which is much simpler. Just hold down the Control key while on the pen tool, and you'll see you have the same direction tool active. You can go in anywhere you want, so you're not bound by anything when using the pen tool. Even more, with the same direct selection tool active, you can click on an anchor point, that's what these points are called, and move them by dragging. Okay, let's see what else there is to know. First, when you use the pen tool, you have to come full circle and close your shape off. We're going to make a triangle to illustrate the point. I already have it made, but you need to close it off in order for it to be completely done. To do that, go to the first point you've set, and you'll see your cursor will have this small O symbol. This means you'll close the shape off. Always do that, no matter if you're on the shape or the path option. But let's say your shape didn't turn out exactly as you wanted it. Maybe you wanted another point here, but you don't want to redo the entire thing. That's easy. Whilst on the pen tool, go to an edge where you've already set some points and click. As long as you're on a line that's between two existing points, you can add more, as many as you like actually, and of course you can modify them as you want. You can even click and hold to add an anchor point, so again your options are unlimited. But now we've gone overboard and we have too many anchor points. How do we remove them? Easy. Just hover over an anchor point and this minus symbol will appear. So again, to add an anchor point, just look for the plus symbol when you hover over a line between 2 points. To delete one, hover over it and look for the minus symbol. If you have this asterisk, that means you'll create a new anchor point. Great, let's continue. If you created rounded lines, but you've changed your mind, you can hold down the Alt key to make them straight. Just look for this cursor and you'll be good to go. You can make rounded lines into straight ones and vice versa. You simply click again to get the other effect. So that's what the Alt or Option key does for you. You might be thinking, hey, this is quite a lot to take in, but if you hold down the pen tool, you'll see all the options I just described. Add anchor point, remove anchor point, convert point tool, but they all do the same thing. You'd much rather keep the pen tool active and use the shortcuts I described. One thing you should know, say you press the Enter key while working. Now all those points have gone and you can no longer add any points to your shape. You can't delete any. What are you supposed to do? If you click, you'll start a new shape. Well, in this case, you have to access the Direct Selection tool and make a selection that will encompass all those points, like this. So I'm selecting them all. Now if I switch back to the Pen tool, I can continue working like I just described. That's the Pen tool for making shapes. Now we're going to talk about creating paths. First, don't worry, this won't take long because everything I just described still applies. Adding, removing, converting anchor points, making them rounded, making them straight, the works. So where would we use the Pen tool in this setup? Well, this is great for making selections. Let me open up an image so I can show you. Okay, I'd like to isolate these hills from the sky. There's a number of ways of doing it, but let me show you one that uses the Pen tool. I'll start from the left side and work my way to the right. I sometimes click to create straight lines, while for these tricky sections, I click and hold so I can get a nice curve. I can go as precise as I want and I can take my time for a great result, or I can do it fast like I'm working now just to illustrate how this works. When I get to the end, I need to circle back around and close the path. When I get this O symbol, I can click and finish it off. Then I'll right-click and choose Make Selection. This is the second major use of the Pen tool. Now my hills are selected, I can do whatever I want with them. Here I'll hold down Alt and click on this mask to create an inverted mask. Now the background is transparent, and if I wanted to, I could create another layer and create a sky of my own with a gradient or solid colour. That's beside the point, so don't worry about it, but the idea is that the Pen tool can help you create some awesome shapes, or on the other hand, you can create detailed selections with it. So that's the Pen tool. Use it without worries. Important notes about other tools. Hi, in this video we'll do a quick overview about some tools I didn't talk about in depth. These are tools I rarely use in my web design work, yet I feel you should know a little bit about them. The lasso tools. There are 3 in total and they're used to create selections. They're not particularly accurate as they require a steady hand and quite a zoomed-in view. This is for fast and broad selections. If I wanted to quickly select this area here, this is how I'd go about it. And this relies on the same Shift and Alt keys to add or subtract from your selection. Shift adds, Alt subtracts. The polygonal lasso is again built for speed, but its twist is that it only works in straight lines. Each click represents another anchor point. If you get it wrong, just press backspace on your keyboard. Depending on how fast you click, this may give you good results. Remember to always come back full circle to close it off and get your selection. The magnetic lasso requires only one click on the edge of the building and then you simply hover across it. Based on various wizardry, Photoshop will recognize that edge and give you a good selection. You could click several times, yet the program decides for itself how many anchor points you need. You also have a bunch of options in this top panel, through which you can fine-tune these settings until they give you a great result. Thing is, most people neglect this tool as it requires more effort. Compare it to the Quick Selection tool and you'll understand why the lassos don't get enough love. The Spot Healing Brush tool. This tool makes any blemish or minor imperfection magically disappear. It relies on the brush tool, so make sure you have a good size. You click on any problem area and it does its job amazingly. I'd actually call this a magic tool. By default, you may have this Sample All Layers option unchecked. This means you must work on your layer directly, which will permanently adjust those pixels. As you probably remember, that's not the recommended way of working. So what we will do is create a new empty layer. Now I'll check this option. Let me get a few more of these spots. It works like a charm. Let's see a before and after because that's easy to do because I can toggle the visibility of this layer. Good stuff. Now let's move on to the healing brush tool. So we've lost the spot from the title. Let's see what we can gain. First, if you try to click, it will tell you that you haven't defined a source point. That's because this tool requires you to point Photoshop in the right direction. You're saying, hey, I want you to match these specific pixels from this particular area. And like a genie, Photoshop does what it's told to do. I recommend you always create a new layer when working with these tools. Each correction should have its own layer and it's best to rename them. The healing brush also has an option whether you'd like to work directly on your image or sample on other layers. I suggest you use current and below. This means it will look for pixels on both your active layer and the ones underneath. If you choose all layers, you're going to get details from layers that are above it, which probably isn't what you want. So I'll hold down the Alt key and click on the clean area. Now I'll paint over the messy ones. It's important to notice you have two cursors on your canvas, which may be confusing. One is showing you where you're painting, while the other one is showing your source. It's vital you keep track of both because if you stray too far, you might end up with something like this. To prevent that from happening, I recommend you click several times. Try it out for a bit to see the best results, but clicking several times usually does a better job. It's also important to note that Photoshop tries its hardest to maintain all the details, shadows, highlights, and edges. The Clone Stamp tool. Although it asks you for a source exactly like the healing brush tool, it doesn't blend pixels. Instead, it just copies them. So that's the essential difference between the two. So if you're trying to fix a problem area, you need to have some clean pixels you can copy over. You might think this is an inferior tool, but it's great when you want to remove an object from a photo. That requires far too much time, and this is not the goal here, but let me tell you what this aligned option does. Let's see it checked. If I sample this spot on the left, and now I click on the right side, you'll see a new spot will have been copied. It doesn't look right, but that's not important. If I want another spot lower down, notice what happens. I'm not getting a red dot because my second cursor is way down. It's being aligned with my primary cursor, if you will. So the aligned option matches the position of your cursor. As I paint downwards, the source moves in that direction as well. Now, let's uncheck it. I'll sample a red dot again, and I'll click several times. As you can see, we're getting dots constantly. Okay, let's continue. The Patch tool. Here's the idea. You create a selection around your problem area. Then you move it somewhere in good condition, say this right part of the image. Though it looks very different as you hover over it, once you let go, Photoshop does its magic, and we end up with a good result. Unfortunately, we have to work directly on our layer as there's no Sample All Layers option. Let's move on to some fantastic tools for retouching. The Sponge tool. This works directly on the layer, so we'll make a duplicate with Ctrl-J to illustrate the effect. Its hotkey is O, and you can use Shift-O to move between these three tools. It has two primary methods of working. It can add or remove colour, exactly like a sponge. Let's add colour to our tree line, our sky, and maybe to her top. I'll choose Saturate as my setting, and I'll use a fairly big brush with a low hardness. That's going to ensure a smooth, feathered transition. We don't want big blotches that might stand out. As you progress, you can toggle the visibility of this new layer and check out the differences. The other mode of working is Desaturate. Let's use that on the boat so you can see how that works. As you can see, it slowly takes away its colour in a natural way. The idea is to build up your result by clicking several times and going over an area. This works best with a tablet with the pressure option checked, but your mouse can do a good job as well. The flow setting decides how fast you apply this effect. Okay, let's move on to the Burn tool. Here I'll create a new layer and I'll use Shift F5 to fill it. From this pop-up, I'll choose 50% grey as my contents. This will help me work non-destructively. Now I can see nothing, but I'll change the blend mode to overlay from the layers panel. We'll talk about these blend modes later. Okay, now apparently there's nothing happening. It seems my layer has vanished, but this gives me the ability to perform various edits, and only they will show up on this layer. Let's start dodging, which implies I'll brighten certain areas. I'll focus on the water mostly, but I'll also touch up the trees a little bit. I'm trying to bring more detail into the image and make it pop. You can also focus a little bit on the girl and on her hair, maybe on her bikini as well. It's up to you. Just remember to disable your 50% grey layer constantly to see the differences. If you want more power on your dodge tool, you can increase the exposure. This spans from 0 to 100%, but you should stick to 30 to 40% at the maximum. I recommend you use your keys to adjust these values constantly. 1 means 10%, 4 means 40%, and so on. Quickly jump between values to get the best results. And again, slowly build up your effect with the help of a soft brush. You can also target specific points of an image by using this range drop-down. I'll speed things up because I don't want us to spend too much time on these various tools. For web design purposes, we'll rarely, if ever, use them. Dodging and burning are one of the best ways to improve an image. Let's focus on the burn tool, which darkens targeted areas. Here I'd like to focus on the sky to see if burning can improve it. And I think it does an excellent job. We can also use it on the girl, specifically on her shoulder, to bring in more colour. This is a great way to make muscles pop. By accentuating the natural grooves in our body, you can get a much more impressive six-pack or muscle definition. Okay, let's wrap it up. Let's look at our result. This is our starting point, and this is where we're at. Now this takes time. Don't speed along as I did. Initially, you must experiment a lot, and I recommend you crank up your exposure so you can really see your impact. Then revert to the original image and start again with milder settings. This concludes our lecture about some of these interesting tools you might use occasionally in various projects. I'd like you to download these images and recreate my steps. Take your time with them and see what you can do. Armed with this knowledge, you can decide for yourself how you can improve an image. Good luck! Section Conclusion. Hello, I hope you've enjoyed your journey. We still have a long way to go, but at this point, you should know the fundamentals about working in Photoshop. This will allow you to create your first design project from start to finish. I know you're excited to get into it and you want to see real-world freelancing projects, but we still must explore some other bits of information before we arrive at that point. If you feel you didn't get certain aspects, I advise you to 1. Practice, practice, practice. You should be able to recreate just about everything I do in these lectures, though sometimes I edit these videos by speeding things up. I never cut out an important part of the process. By working alongside me, you're getting a far better experience. And 2, ask questions in the comments area. There are tens of thousands of students, and some go out of their way to answer your queries. I really appreciate the camaraderie and their effort. I also chime in with my answer, so you can directly interact with me. Please don't send direct messages because chances are other students might have the same question as you. Finally, I want to explain some miscellaneous things. Why do I always mention you should have fun? Well, the program can be very stressful and frustrating. You don't remember what tool does what, you forgot the hotkey, what properties a certain layer type has, and so on, and your result differs from what you see on screen. As with any journey, you'll encounter obstacles. That's why I'm constantly reminding you to have a relaxed attitude towards learning. This produces the best results. Over the years, I've had students from all over the world watch my courses. Some had an excellent financial situation, while others struggled to support their families. And that's why they resorted to this course, to create a stable income and put food on the table. I understand it can be frustrating when you want to succeed so badly, yet results aren't coming in. Are you stupid? Are you hard-headed? Are you lazy? No, of course not. It's this thinking that hinders your performance. If you don't believe in yourself, if you beat yourself up when you don't get good results, then I can assure you things won't become easier. I know it's hard to enjoy the process. You don't want ups and downs through a long journey. You want concrete results in the shortest possible time. Yet if it were that easy, everybody would do it. So my advice is this: be a curious learner. Ask questions, get involved, perform these exercises, and trust in my experience. You'll need time to develop your skills. Don't be too hard on yourself and try to enjoy the process. The other bit I wanted to talk about is how this course is related to my other ones. I've mentioned it often, but I'll say it again. It's years and years of experience that I'm trying to concentrate in a few hours. It's inevitable that some parts must be left out. That's why I created separate courses for a more in-depth approach. This is why sometimes I direct you to course X or course Y. It's not because I'm trying to milk you for more money, it's because I can't possibly cover everything in one course. Plus, everybody has their own interests. Maybe the dodging and burning really sparked something in you and you want to know more about them. Well, that's beside the point of this course, so you might see another lecture or lectures in another course of mine dedicated to projects that specifically need dodging and burning. Okay, let's talk about selections. We covered 2 examples, but it's a huge subject. If you want to go in depth, I'd say we'd need at the very minimum 2 hours of concentrated material. I'm letting you know all this because I find it very hurtful when I read messages that say I'm promoting other courses too much. It's true I get a few of these messages, yet I do feel the need to address them. I'll wrap it up with this. Each course has a specific goal. This one aims to teach you how to use Photoshop to a certain extent, but the real value is in the freelancing aspect. How to choose the best contests, how to deal with clients, how you can outsmart your competition and make money. Photoshop for beginners takes a broader approach, so when I present the tools, I'm not talking purely from a web design perspective. I can go in more detail about certain features and cases. Master Web Design in Photoshop is aimed at improving your skills as a web designer, and it's a fine line here. Winning contests versus being a fantastic designer. Those are separate lines, and I explain why I think that's the case in a separate lecture. So to wrap things up, I hope you're ready to transition into the web design phase of this course. I also wanted to clear up some potential questions regarding my approach on things and why I sometimes mention my other courses. With that said, let's continue.